Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a few weeks since we've had an episode of our Min Ed Soda podcast. We are recording today on July 1st. It's the first day of the new fiscal year for schools and our state budgets. And big news, only a month late, the budgets came out last night, and we today, Todd, have invited one of our previous guests back to talk about that budget. The first on the Min Ed Soda podcast, the first returning guest, your good friend from up in Lakes
Yeah,
Country, Mr. Troy Haugen.
yeah, this is a historic podcast, Troy. First time ever in the history of the Minnesota podcast that we've had a repeat guest on. So, not like there's any pressure on you to perform at the highest of your abilities, but we know that you can do it. So, and Kip, the whole shutdown scare was that certainly could have been something that impacted the work of our regional centers of excellence. So I'm just happy that I get the opportunity to be here with you today and with Troy, and we get to record this podcast and get it out to everybody. So I think we have lots to talk about today. So without any further ado, I just want to introduce Troy Haugen. He is one of my colleagues at Lakes Country Service Co-op. He is director of CTE programs, correct, Troy? He wears a lot of hats at Lakes Country, and I think when he's got a little bit of downtime, he probably does windows and takes care of kids as well. So the guy does everything. Um, so Troy, we've been hearing about this whole, the whole budget bill with the state legislature. They finally got their work done. I don't think there were any late or any points taken off of their work because it was late. They weren't sent to detention. Well, actually, I suppose if they had to come back to such special session, that would be a form of detention. But
Would say so.
But they
yeah,
act like they're not fined. Actually, they make more money by coming back.
I know, which
True.
I don't understand. Like if I don't do my job, I don't get more money to do overtime to mop it up. But that's a whole nother podcast. That's a whole nother story. But Troy, obviously we wanted to have you. I was thinking about you last week. I wanted to get you back on here so that you could kind of give us kind of a bird's eye view of the bill that was passed yesterday, all the work that got finished up yesterday. Tell us a little bit about the bills that were passed. There's a lot of different stuff that got worked on over the course of the past few weeks during the special session. What are the things that we need to know as Minnesota educators? How is this bill going to affect us? So kind of first give us a bird's eye view, and then let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of how this is going to affect the work that we do.
Sure. Well, thanks, Todd. Thanks, Kip. Lots of things happened, and it seems to always happen at the end, and that's just kind of how it goes, Yep, we averted a government shutdown, a state government shutdown by the legislature passing the E-12 Omnibus bill yesterday afternoon and going to the governor's desk late yesterday afternoon and him signing it. That was the last of all of the budget bills to be passed. There was one bill to be passed after that, the tax committee bill, the taxes bill, but that's not a budget bill. So if that bill would not have been passed, and it actually didn't get passed and signed by the governor until it hasn't been signed by the governor yet, I don't think. That didn't get passed till the wee hours of the morning yet. But because that's not a budget bill, the taxes bill didn't shut the state down. We can still collect taxes based on the old bill, the old legislative language. So they're not, the tax bill isn't incumbent upon the government continuing to run. They're going to they know better. The state legislature knows better to collect taxes regardless of what the legislature decides what to do or not. I think we all figured that out a long time ago. But so omnibus bills in general, are these great big massive bills based on topic areas. So E-12 is actually the biggest omnibus bill the state has, because E-12 is the largest part of the state budget. So these omnibus, what happens over the course of the legislative session is all of these smaller bills get introduced. And so let's say I meet with a local legislator and I say, I want to do this in education. And I have this idea, it wants to fix this problem, or I want this certain fiscal allocation in E-12 education. And the bill gets introduced both in the House and the Senate. It goes to committee, and what happens is the committee, if they hear it in their committee hearing, they will oftentimes, what they'll say is, we will hold this over for possible inclusion in the E-12 omnibus bill. So then after the regular, during that time where everybody hears all of these small bills, in the committee deadlines, then the chairs of those committees will then decide, what are we going to put in this one massive bill that will go and basically create the E-12 omnibus bill. And then there's also the E-12 Judiciary and Public Safety Bill, or not E-12, but the Judiciary and Public Safety Bill. Then there's an Agriculture Bill, Omnibus Bill. There's a Transportation Omnibus Bill. So all of these functions of state government have these omnibus bills. There's a lot of folks that don't like this omnibus bill type of situation, because if you don't like if one party or the other that is in power or isn't in power doesn't like one small provision of that bill, there's a poison pill in the bill, they could stop that whole component or that whole bill from becoming law, therefore shutting government down for certain piece. So let's say E-12 again was the last bill that needed to be passed for the government for education to be funded for the next 2 years. The House is controlled by the Democrats. The Senate is controlled by the Republicans. We're the only split legislature in the United States. Let's say the House passed it a couple of days ago. It went to the Senate. The Senate had a floor hearing, and they debated it for a while yesterday. Then it got laid over for a little while, and then they brought it back up, and then they voted. But let's say that the Senate, and they actually voted, and it passed unanimously, which meant it went to the governor's desk. But let's say the Senate, who again is Republican control. Let's say the Senate Senate Republicans all of a sudden decided, nope, we don't like it anymore, and they voted to not pass it. Well, now, and they just there's 3 lines in the entire 71-page bill that they didn't like, and midnight came and went. We do not have a budget bill. And E-12 education is no longer funded. There are provisions within E-12 that has no budget then. So everything within E-12 is no longer funded at that point. So what do we do? Versus if we were to go through a non-omnibus situation where every piece has its own bill that goes through the legislature separately, there's this, then let's say the formula goes through a bill in and on it by itself, then the formula could go through by itself, and that provision of statute can go by itself. And let's say the provisions that are related to, one of the pieces that went through is a lot of language around increasing teachers of color. Some language changes, and there's some funding attached to that. If that went through as a separate bill, then that would be separate rather than everything going together. So that's this whole piece around omnibus bills. And that's why we see these massive pieces happen at the end, is because all of the work happens at the beginning, and then there's this huge lull in the middle that a lot of folks just don't really engage with, because it really becomes only a few people negotiating, and then a huge massive piece at the end. And the end seems to be getting later and later and later and later and later every biennium. So that's the kind of the really over 10,000, 30,000 foot overview. So what's in the E-12 bill?
I was gonna say, so here's where we're at as of yesterday afternoon into early evening. The omnibus bill was what went through. It passed.
Yep.
And as you were talking, I heard two nuggets that we really want to highlight. One, you said it passed the Senate unanimously. That was
Yes.
55-0. That doesn't happen very often, especially around education.
Right.
And two, you mentioned it was only a 71-page bill.
Right.
And so obviously that means there's not a lot of language changes or provisions around changes, maybe around student discipline, around entrance into the teaching workforce, the teacher licensing. There's not a doesn't sound like what I'm understanding then from what you're sharing is there's a whole lot of changes that way. And maybe it was because it was so pared down, it was much easier to be unanimous.
And that's what I was going to say too, Kip. But, if it's a 71-page bill and it went unanimous, that tells me there's not a lot of controversial stuff in there.
Yep.
Is that right?
If I was a golfer, you just teed me up. So I think if I remember right, the original House bill was something like 170 some pages. The original Senate bill was something like 130 some pages. And ultimately the conference committee bill the agreed upon bill that was passed and is now law was 71 pages. And the last 10 pages of that bill was the revenue adjustment, the forecast adjustments, which are just basically, this is what our actual revenue is based on the forecast. So we're just going to make all of these technical adjustments. So that is really nothing. So it's really a 61-page bill, which tells you there isn't much really in there. In fact, when Senator Chamberlain, who is the chair of the Senate Education Committee, presented the bill yesterday, he said, this is a money, not mandates bill. Really basically saying all we really addressed was some basic money pieces. And it really telegraphed what this really bill is about. This is kind of okay, here's some money. So it basically gets 2.45% on the formula the first year and 2% on the formula the second year.
Which is the most ever added to the formula at one time. And there was another line that the senator shared that I think really kind of highlights too. He talked about you said it was about money and not mandates.
Yep.
And then his next line was, it's about local control. And so this really, I mean, this is sounds like a slam dunk for both Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats got the money that they were kind of asking for, and the Republicans got let's keep the state government out of schools. And here you go, schools, this is your money. Use it how you see best, because there's no new mandates on it. So it's a little bit of a win for everyone. But but then there's also stuff that's not there for everyone.
Right. There's a lot of context to that I think we need to unpack over time, because there is. Let's come back to that, because there's a lot of context, particularly around what's called the Posse Caucus, which is the people of color and indigenous caucus. They call themselves the Posse Caucus. That really feels really is really upset with how this ultimately played out, because they did not get many of the provisions that they really wanted and needed in this bill to further along what's needed for students, particularly students of color in our education system. So, and I think that you could see that and feel that with the narrative a little bit yesterday, probably more in the House than in the Senate. But yeah, I think but it's a really tenuous place to play. So it's politics. Its bottom line is politics. But you're absolutely right, Kip. The other thing that he said, that Senator Chamberlain said, and I'm not quoting him by this, but he says it's not about systems, it's about kids. And that really is a dig at a couple of different groups and a couple of different pieces, but he really wanted to focus on that we're really trying to put things at put the resources at the level of students and not at overarching systems. So, and that's an interesting perspective to think about when we're talking through some of these pieces that they funded. So the 2.45 and 2% on the formula is huge, particularly if we think about the larger context of all the three sets of federal funds that have come in through the CARES Act, the SRSA funding that came in the second round, and the ARP funding now that's come in, that's starting to come in now with the third round as well. So that's a lot of federal and state money that has come in through into school districts now over the course of this fiscal year and the next couple of fiscal years. So the management of those funds is going to be absolutely integral. The other really big thing that happened with funding is they maintain the VPK, the voluntary pre-K levels, for the next 2 years. That was actually set to go away in this upcoming fiscal year. So they maintain that VPK funding for the next 2 fiscal years. Now that means after 2023, it's not set to be funded again, but there's at least 2 more years going on at this point. So those are the 2 really biggest funding pieces. Beyond that, there's some cross-subsidy aid for EL students. There's, as I kind of mentioned before, there's several increased teachers of color provisions, and there's a grow your own pathway provision, and several actually provisions that increase the teacher workforce. There's a good chunk of money, I think $3 million in what's called letters training, which is language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. That's the first time that the legislature has funded that. And there's actually some special ed cross subsidy reduction aid, which will help. It doesn't ever get us to that 40% that kind of the federal government has always promised, but there's again some cross subsidy reduction aid for special ed in there as well. As far as policy provisions, there's really nothing. The increased teachers of color piece is somewhat of a policy provision. It added some opportunities, but it's more of a grant type of opportunities. But there's not really any policy changes there. The only real policy change, I mean, there are some things, but nothing that's massive. The one thing that you're hearing a little bit about is the standards implementation suspension until 2023. I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what that is. I think people are thinking that means that the social studies standards, that whole process has stopped. That is not the case. The standards implementation suspension is actually, if you read the language, it's the implementation of standards that have already basically been approved and gone through the rulemaking process that were set to be implemented after January 1st, 2021. It delays it till June 1st of 2023. That's really only 2 sets of standards. That is art and PE. There's a line in that in the now law that says it does not prohibit the Department of Education from stopping any existing rulemaking, which the social studies standard is in existing rulemaking right now. So it has not stopping the social studies standards rulemaking process. Now, the piece around that is that it's still in rulemaking. They are still in the process of creating those social studies standards. It's nowhere close to being done, the social studies standards. So it's still a long ways from implementation. But I think there is this overarching thought that, okay, social studies standards is done. It's not going to be till, we're delaying that for 2 years. No, it's still in the process, but it's still in the process. So that's really about it. It's about money and really not about mandates.
So the bill comes out is signed on June 30th. Many of our principals take most of July off vacation, especially this year. I shouldn't say most. It's when they tend to use their vacation time because there's often not a lot happening in schools with students and stuff. Summer school is kind of wrapping up, or it's being set aside until early August, those types of things. So I don't want to make it like, hey, principals aren't working, but this just tends to be the time that they're hitting their pre-planned vacations that they have. And especially this year after the pandemic year, we're hearing from a lot of principals that, God, we just need to unplug for a little bit, get out. So this bill comes as everybody's leaving.
Yep.
So what is kind of like the quick takeaway for a school leader of like what they need to know so that when they are ready to hit the ground running, when they rejuvenate here, that it's everything they need to know to just get going? And actually, it sounds like it's not a whole lot.
There's not much you need to know. Really, it's as far as policy provisions, you don't have to worry about art and PE being implemented implemented this next year. That's about it. And everything else is at the district office level because it's fiscal priorities. Really, that's about it. I can't even think of anything that really steps out. There's nothing in licensure that was touched. There's nothing, yeah, there really isn't much that I can think about. I can't say that I've read every word or every letter of the bill, but I've paged through it probably 5 times now, and I can't even say that I've underlined anything yet.
So ultimately, where we're at, if I'm understanding you correctly and you're kind of interpreting, I mean, obviously there's
Yep.
more that's going to come out, but is that we're being mandated to do all the things that we'd been previously mandated to do, but we just have more money to do it.
That's probably an oversimplistic, but I think it's probably generally, yeah, I would say it's probably in general, yeah, it's probably pretty close. I think we're being impacted more by the federal ARP dollars and the SRSA dollars and the CARES dollars than we are really by the state policy provisions right now. I would say that.
That's a big sigh there,
I
Todd.
was gonna say, boy,
You had something.
that was a heck of a sigh.
Well, I just written down in my notes here, Posse Caucus. So I don't know if you.
Oh yeah.
Did you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to be being very cognizant of is we're living in this time that is really tenuous. We've got all of these, this polarized time about what's happening in this social piece. We've got school districts and school leaders that are being pulled in so many directions when we use the word equity, when we use the word when we talk about anything related to culturally responsive teaching. Even CRT, culturally responsive teaching, is now being equated to critical race theory. All of this stuff is just really becoming so almost explosive. And you've got this caucus of legislators that are the Posse Caucus of legislators that are really working hard to capture what students of color need and really trying to capture this moment. And I can't speak for them, obviously, but I don't think that they're feeling they got what they need. And I think for a period of time, they could have really stopped this process. We could have been shut down if they wanted to, but they didn't. And they probably had every right to, because we know what the data shows. If we really want to talk about how every student in our schools should have opportunities to succeed, not every student in our schools have the opportunity to succeed, and I don't think that always our laws represent that. And I don't think that, and clearly that doesn't always necessarily mean race. That doesn't always necessarily mean anything other than what it is. So I just think that we just have to be really cognizant about how that plays out politically and policy-wise over the next several years. So I would say, watch this. This is far from being far from being over. I mean, obviously this legislative session is over. We have some pieces that are moving forward, but there's still a lot of pieces that are, while on the surface it feels really good that there were no mandates and there were no necessarily increased mandates and there's some good money coming forward. There are people that really feel like there probably should have been some mandates because we are not progressing as quickly as we should have.
Now, based on what you just shared, though, it's also just a good reminder for everyone listening that in Minnesota, our budget is done on 2-year cycles.
Correct.
So this is a 2-year budget. So when the legislature reconvenes next January for the off year in the budget cycle, that is typically the year that we start. There's a lot even more in-depth conversations around some of those policy things because it's not about keeping the lights on for the whole state at that time. Leverage is lost a little bit because there's no budget attached to it, or you can hold up the budget process, but it doesn't make all those things that any of our caucuses are looking for to be dead in the water. It just means they're pushed down the road and they'll be addressed in the non-budget year potentially.
It's interesting that to Kip's point, the odd number years are always the budget years. The even number years are always what are called bonding and policy years. But the last several even years have also had supplemental budgets attached to them. Typically, well, not even typically, because there's been a surplus. We don't know, obviously, if there'll be a budget forecast of a surplus. If there's a budget forecast of a surplus, there could be a budget revision that includes a budget. So that could be that there will be, in the 2022 session, which will probably kick off sometime in February. That's typically when they reconvene. There might be an opportunity for some of those provisions to move through, but it doesn't have to happen. If the legislature convenes in February and gavels out in May, they don't have to do anything in the even number year. They could gavel in sometime after January and gavel out the day after, and we could be done, and we would move forward. That's probably not what they're going to do, but they could, because the budget is already set. That is the only constitutional thing that they have to do if we want to maintain our government for the next 2 years. But it could. I mean, so that's why I say keep an eye, because if we see a budget surplus, priorities will start to surface very soon, very quickly after that November forecast comes out, the first part of December. I'm getting into the weeds, I know, but I'm a geek like that.
Yeah, I had a quick question for you. I had read earlier today that there was a large tax cut or a tax relief bill that passed as well. Do you think that was part of the workings of this special session, was to get the education bill passed in the Senate unanimously, was getting this tax cut bill passed?
No doubt. I mean, they're all connected. When the Senate heard the education bill yesterday, they started that hearing sometime mid-morning. They had heard all of the debate, the floor debate, and then at the end of the floor debate, they paused and laid it on the table until after they heard the tax committee. Well, why did they do that? Because they still wanted to make sure that they had leverage to make sure that continued conversation happened about the tax bill. The governor even, there's still debate about whether the governor actually gave up his emergency powers today, or if the House forced him to give up his emergency powers as of today. Regardless, he gave up his emergency powers expired, at midnight last night. That was a bargaining chip of all of this, of all of this happening. So yes, every piece of this are bargaining chips. Sending out notifications to all people that are paid for by paid for by all state employees, getting notifications about July 1, you may be put on furlough because you are a state employee. That is a bargaining chip. I mean, to be honest with you, all of these pieces are bargaining chips of the entire system of politics.
Well, all I know is that in our RC team, we had that meeting about, potential shutdown, and I told my wife about it, and I think she got excited because she's thinking, knock some things off the honey-do list.
You're still probably going to have to, but now you're just going to have to do it both while working and doing that.
I know. Darn it. Well, I still like coming to work, so we get to do great work in our jobs, don't we, Kip?
We do. It's a good life. Good life
it
spending
is.
time with school leaders. So
Yes, it is.
well, Troy, thank you for taking us through that very important budget update. It does have a significant impact on our school districts here in Minnesota. Even just an understanding of like the omnibus bill process and some of those types of more political junky items you got into, but it really helps give an understanding of why things play out the way they do and how come sometimes those bills go to the last minute because everything's in it. There's not anything really standalone, and you got to make sure you got the votes. Otherwise, you're starting over. So we really appreciate you being our first return guest, and it was, well, for me, I found it very fascinating. I'm hoping our listeners do as well, but we appreciate it.
You bet. Let's make it a repeat, maybe.
Well, don't get too excited there, Mr. Hogan.
Okay, all right.
I'm totally joking. I find that the whole political process super fascinating. It's not like I've it's one of those things that being an educator, it always plays into what we do. There's always something that when it happens in the legislative session, it's going to impact you as a teacher. It's going to impact you as a school leader. It can impact you as a community member. So it's one of those things where I know that I've talked to plenty of educators that they have the mindset of, I just wish we would be left alone and we can teach. And, yes, that would be awesome. But because we are funded through this political process, it's important that we are aware of it and we are active in the process, because if you just sit there and don't say anything and let things happen to you, that's not a good feeling either. So I appreciate you coming back, Troy, and giving us that update. It's super interesting. So yeah. So Kip, let's wrap this baby up. Kip, what do you got planned for this upcoming weekend? Right around the corner, we got 4th of July. You must have big plans out on lake.
Yeah, well, we're not on our lake. We're heading up north. We're going to go visit my in-laws up in the Brainerd Lakes area and hang out for a couple days with my in-laws and enjoy that time. That's been our 4th of July tradition since my wife and I started dating. So we're going on like 25 years of, and for her longer, but for me, with her, 25 years of celebrating the 4th of July up in the Brainerd Lakes area. How about you?
I was going to make a comment about how, you've been going up there even before there were lakes in the Brainerd area, but I can't really rib you about that too much because I think I'm older than you. So
you are older, but I certainly display a lot more gray. So anybody watching on YouTube can see the big gray in my beard, and yeah,
you just got to keep it knocked down like I do. No, I think we're actually moving out of our house this weekend. We sold our house and we are going to be moving to our house that we're building. And so this weekend is not going to be super exciting from my viewpoint. It's going to be packing. It's going to be putting flooring down this weekend in the new house. So it's going to be more work. So, but that's all right. I'm looking forward to getting that thing wrapped up and just having one house to worry about, not two right now. So that's where I'm at.
Well, all right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. Remember to like and subscribe however you find us. Some of you are watching us on YouTube. Some are on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple. We're getting more well-rounded, but guarantee that you get our next episode. whenever it comes out, because we are now on our summer schedule. And when something timely comes up, we're kind of just recording and otherwise letting our school leaders enjoy their time away. So we appreciate you listening.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
All right. We'll see you in the next episode.